My name is Yari Krivoy. I am director of the Investment Treaty Forum, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law for the 39th ITF conference devoted to energy disputes in investor-state dispute settlement. This conference is oversubscribed. I mean, the in-person component of it, which is quite unusual, and it shows the level of interest in energy-related issues. And so I welcome our ITF members and guests of this conference who are present here in the room, and also our online audience. We have almost 100 people who registered for this event, coming from various jurisdictions. They include legal practitioners, primarily based in London, government officials, academics. We also have representatives of intergovernmental organizations. We will have in-house lawyers here in the room. So it's a diverse group of people, and I hope that the list of issues which we are going to discuss is interesting and useful. And I really look forward to this intellectual treat. I'm sure that you had a busy week, and now you can, most of you can just relax and listen, and some of you will also have to do a bit of speaking, but I hope that you will also enjoy it. And the way how we at the Investment Treaty Forum select topics is not something which I personally like. Usually I speak to various ITF members trying to understand what are those issues which worry them, what are those issues where we could have about which we need to have a serious discussion. And the war in Ukraine, COVID, transition to greener technologies, global warming. So all those issues did not really exist, or they were not that serious, let's say 10 years ago, compared to what we have now. And those issues affect the real life, and they also affect lawyers. They also have legal issues. They also affect investor-state cases, which are decided by tribunals. Before moving on to the substance of the conference, I would like to make a few announcements about the forthcoming events of the Investment Treaty Forum. So I think the next one will be on the 1st of June. It will be devoted to mining disputes in investor-state arbitration. The event will be hosted by Volterra Fietta. Then on the 14th of June, Young ITF, which is a branch of ITF, which unites primarily junior associates, they organize an event on valuation of damages. And it will be actually a workshop rather than like a traditional conference. The next event which we have on the list will be hosted by Latham and Watkins on the 4th of July. And it will be a roundtable on economic sanctions and arbitration, where we'll look at various aspects of sanctions and how they affect dispute resolution, particularly arbitration. We're also working on a number of research papers with some Investment Treaty Forum members, including on taxation and arbitration with Wilmer Hale, on performance requirements with Steptoe and Johnson. We also work on banking and finance disputes in ISDS with Deckard. With Cooley, we work on technology disputes. So I hope that sooner rather than later, those papers will also be ready, and then we'll have launch events, and you will definitely get an invitation to those events. In addition, I would like to remind you that our online course, International Investment Law and Dispute Resolution, is available. So if you have junior people joining your teams whom you want to introduce to the basic concepts of investor-state arbitration, international investment law, it's easy to subscribe, and it's very cheap, particularly for ITF members. Let me know if you're interested. And also this summer, we're organizing, I am personally involved in organizing London Summer Arbitration School. It's particularly interesting for those people who want to know about not just commercial arbitration, investor-state arbitration, but also other areas of arbitration. For example, commodities arbitration, maritime arbitration, banking and finance arbitration, and so on. I already delivered the the 2023 annual ISDS to some law firms, and some I will see later this year. So hope to continue conversation about the hottest topics in investor state dispute settlement. Today we will focus on energy disputes in ISDS, and I hope you have enough energy to be here until 4:15. We don't want to take your Friday evening, but we hope that you will enjoy the whole day here. We have a keynote address and 3 panels. The first panel will give an overview of key issues in energy disputes and ISDS, which will be followed by coffee break, which will take place here in this room. Then we'll talk about transition to green energy and the Energy Charter Treaty reform. After that, we will have a lunch break, which will take place 1 level below. There is a room downstairs. Then we'll have energy. The last panel will focus on the issues which are arising, so the emerging issues in the context of energy investor state disputes. And then we'll have closing remarks to summarize some of the messages which we will discuss today. I would encourage you to use LinkedIn, Twitter, and other social networks to promote this event. And if you do so, please use ITF law hashtag. You will see it on some of the slides later. With this, let me turn to introducing our keynote speaker. And we invited Professor Nick Butler today, also in response to what was expressed by members of the Investment Treaty Forum, because some said, we already had so many lawyers, so many arbitrators talking about arbitration issues. It would be interesting to hear actually a perspective of a user of our services, someone who is a not lawyer or who used to be not a lawyer, but in the context of but worked in the context of large energy disputes. And I was very lucky to find Professor Nick Butler, who is a visiting professor at King's College London. He is founding chair of the Policy Institute at King's College London, and he used to be a group vice president for strategy and policy at BP. And he also served as senior policy advisor to Prime Minister Gordon Brown. And he kindly agreed to talk about more general trends which are happening with the energy, how they are likely to affect disputes which may arise in relation to energy. And he also said that he would think about some interesting anecdotes, maybe of his interactions with lawyers in the past when he was running BP. So we are very grateful, Professor Nick Butler, for that you accepted our invitation. We look forward to your talk. And Professor Butler also agreed to take questions at the end. So keep your questions, and then we'll have a discussion after the keynote. The floor is yours.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've been in the energy industry for far too long now, and I've interacted with lawyers in every job that I've done. And I've always found it an enriching experience, intellectually enriching for me, financially enriching for the lawyers. So I was very pleased when Jarek invited me, and I asked, as economists always do, what's the fee? And I was very relieved when he said, don't worry, you don't have to pay anything. I am not a lawyer. What I want to do is to try and give you a view of how the energy industry, and I'll focus on the international companies rather than any other part of the industry, though it is obviously much bigger than those international companies, how they see the future now and the challenges they face. And that is because I think in each of the challenges, there is a very substantial legal element, and I'll come to that. So I think the first challenge is the changing geography of the industry. This is a graph, a very authoritative forecast of global demand. Energy demand continues to grow year by year, dented by COVID, but still continuing at 1 or 2% a year on average. And it grows for two reasons. One is the growth of population. So in an hour, if you're here for an hour, by the end of that hour, the world's population will be almost 10,000 higher than it was at the beginning. 250,000 a day, 85 million a year. And that is the key driver of energy demand. The second is prosperity, the ability of people to buy commercial energy supplies. And I think the most recent calculation I've seen is that because of the growth of the economies, particularly in Asia, there are something like 200 million new customers for commercial energy every year. These are the drivers of demand. And the interesting thing from a corporate perspective is that that demand is almost entirely in Asia. China, one country, now accounts for almost 30% of daily energy consumption worldwide. And that is growing. And Asia will soon be more than half of global energy demand. In Europe, energy demand is falling thanks to efficiency gains and deindustrialization. And the UK, I always find very interesting, now uses less energy every day than it did in 1965. So the future market for the corporate world is not so much here, it's around the world. And the challenge for the companies is how to penetrate Asia, a very different culture, in many cases with very strong local companies, and an area where in general, Western companies have very little knowledge and very few people who speak the languages and who know how to operate there. The second great challenge facing the energy business is climate change. I think there is now, apart from the Republican Party in the US, a broad acceptance of the science of climate change and of the risks that it could bring. There's obviously great uncertainty because the science is unfinished, but you do now have 160 countries around the world who in one degree or another are now committed to achieve net zero by 2050, 2060, in India's case, 2070, but all in one direction. The challenge is that those commitments have been made, but very little actual progress is happening in making the shift. Let me ask you a question. How big a percentage of UK energy supply do you think is accounted for by renewables, by wind and solar power? Any guesses? No guesses. Water, any advance on that? The answer is 7%. And if you look, and this is true here, and it's true across the world, you perhaps can't see that graph clearly enough. I'll send around all the slides. Hydrocarbons, oil, gas, and coal account for 3/4 or more of total energy demand. And that is exactly the same as it was 25 years ago. So demand is growing, renewables are growing too, and in some areas growing quite quickly, but they only provide electricity, and electricity is only 20% of final energy demand. So there's a concern about climate change. It's growing, it's political. And the companies are caught in the middle of this. They are making money from doing something which in many cases they themselves have recognized and stated is dangerous. That causes reputational damage. It in some cases causes dissent within companies. And they face the risk, and this is a boardroom view now, of becoming the new tobacco industry. There is a cloud over their valuations because they hold reserves. And if it looks as if the world is really going to move to net zero, those reserves have very limited value. And in the meantime, demand is rising. So the companies are needed, but not wanted. And this is psychologically difficult for enterprises to cope with. The third challenge is conflict. Energy is now part of many conflicts, and there's nothing new in that. Most of the major companies have been in business for over 100 years. They've lived through war and revolutions and expropriation. But now there is the added dimension of energy as a tool of conflict. And you mentioned, Jarek, Ukraine. Sorry, that's the graph I should have shown on emissions continuing to run. This is Ukraine, and this is Russian gas trade into Europe. And Mr. Putin obviously thought a year ago, 15 months ago, that Europe could be neutralized and would not resist his attempt to take over Ukraine because it was so dependent on natural gas through all these pipelines. Europe has actually managed with some difficulty and at some cost to get through one winter by bringing in gas from other parts of the world. But there is still a risk. There's a risk that the Russians will cut off the remaining supplies, or, as we see this week, that they might attack the energy infrastructure in the North Sea or elsewhere in Europe to drive home the fact that Europe is import dependent for most of its energy supply. That's one form of conflict where the companies which are just operating in the middle of this, many of them investors in these pipelines and in the gas supply and in Russia until last year. There are other forms of conflict as well. And the one that I see rising now is the conflict for dominance of the low carbon industrial market. So things may be moving slowly, but if all these countries have made a pledge to move towards net zero, quite a lot is going to change. Electric vehicles, batteries, turbines, solar panels, raw materials are all going to be crucial. They're going to be a great source of economic activity and jobs. The estimate from the International Energy Agency is that in the period to 2040, this is a $4 trillion business. And therefore, there's great competition to have the leading role in that business. At the moment, the leading power in low carbon industry is China. China produces almost 80% of all the batteries produced anywhere in the world and processes the minerals that are needed in different parts of the new energy system. It is the dominant producer of wind and solar panels. Former Prime Minister here said that we were the Saudi Arabia of wind. We do have a lot of wind power in the North Sea, but most of it runs on Chinese wind turbines. The fear of Chinese dominance, which is growing because of their desire to be a global industrial power, using the hold that they have over strategic minerals, using their low cost base, and using their ability to subsidize Chinese businesses in the sector. That is compounded by their development now of international activity around this. And the Belt and Road, the Chinese international program, is taking them through political and economic, and in some cases, military alliances into Pakistan, into Africa, into the Middle East. They are importing oil and gas, and they're exporting technology and arms. And this is part of the Chinese growing role in the world. And you can call it a peaceful rise, or you can call it a strategic challenge, but it is creating a response. And this response starts in the US. This is a slide of the President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed last year. And this is essentially a basket of subsidies to develop low carbon business in the US. Tied to it is a requirement now that companies that are going to receive any of this huge package of subsidies have to produce activity in the US. This is at least 40% local content should be from the US. And that has led to several European companies already moving. The UK have come up with a proposed response, a Net Zero Industry Act, which is more about regulation than subsidies, because Europe doesn't have the spare cash. But again, there's a 40% requirement for local content. And Europe is proposing strategic alliances with countries like Chile and Australia to secure strategic minerals. These are inherently protectionist measures. And so what you're moving to is three competing blocks: China, the US, and Europe, all trying to get the lead in this new industrial revolution around low carbon. Now, I think all these challenges involve legal issues, and you will know more about this than I do, but I give you the view from the companies. This is what I believe they think. Let's go take them in reverse order. Conflicts now around the world are not, in general, in Ukraine is an exception to this, pursued by military force, by trench warfare, sending missiles. The key tool is sanctions rather than military attacks. And this is a map, again, I hope you can see it, of the sanctions imposed by the United States on different parts of the world. The sanctions are not just on Russia because of Ukraine, but they're also on Iran. There are technology sanctions on China, and there are numerous sanctions related to human rights abuses. The sanctions are both direct and indirect. They can focus on anyone doing business with Russia or the other targeted countries. When I worked in BP, one of our ambitions, this was at a time when the regime was a little different in Iran, was to get back to Iran. And any discussion of doing that had to exclude the Americans. They had to leave the room, otherwise they were breaking US sanctions legislation. I was allowed to go, and I was very pleased to go. I went to Tehran several times to try and negotiate BP back in. They weren't ready for it. In the end, BP wouldn't have gone back in because of the American pressure not to do so. This is the impact of sanctions. And I think since then, and that's some years ago, those sanctions are the first tool of choice in any conflict, and that restrains open business activity. And to me, this is part of a story of globalization now being in retreat. It is segmented. And then on to climate change. Companies are, as I said, needed but not wanted. The reputation is already constraining. The major companies can't now support the arts. British Museum, National Gallery, Portrait Gallery, the Tate, many others have, the Royal Shakespeare Company, have all said no to investment by oil and gas companies. And the security risks increase. So next week's BP annual general meeting will be a fortress surrounded by security. That's not so much a legal issue, but it does have an impact on business activity. The legal issue is that the UK has a commitment to net zero, a binding legal commitment. And campaigners are now arguing that any new hydrocarbon development should be ruled out because it's unnecessary. There are sufficient resources around the world to fill up the carbon budget, which we have agreed, and there are already enough oil and gas supplies. So a new development is not needed. And we've seen that argument over the coal mine in Cumbria. We've seen it over the Cambo field of Shell. And this is the next one. And this will be a significant challenge next year. This is the development of the next oil field in the North Sea, at Rosebank, north of the Shetlands. This is an Equinor, a Statoil development, and I declare an interest as an advisor to Equinor. But they are now going to face the fact that there will be a multiply-layered challenge to that development going ahead. There will be public protest. There will be people gluing themselves to the door of the Equinor office down the road. But there will also be a legal challenge that government approval of this development is contrary to the UK's commitment to net zero. And I think that that is just one relatively small field. I think as people see that emissions continue to rise, that the policy agreements, Paris Accord and everything else is not actually working yet, I think those disputes will become more bitter. There will be more direct action, and there will be more pressure on governments to stop developments like this. And I think if there is a change of government here, the current opposition are opposed to new developments in the North Sea, as is the Scottish government. And we will see much legal debate on the contradiction between the need for resources, the fact that these resources can be developed more cleanly than resources from Russia or Venezuela or Nigeria, which is the alternative, against our net zero legal commitment. And then there's a new legal risk associated with climate change, and that is liability. I think that will also grow as emissions keep rising, especially if the impact of climate change is not this. There's a perception that it's going to be a very gradual and linear increase in temperature by up to 1.5, 2 degrees by the end of the century. That's possible. I think it's much more likely that this is climate disruption. Of course, we've never done the experiment with the Earth's atmosphere that we're now doing, so we don't know. But it looks as if there will be more extreme weather, more heat waves, more floods, and more damage. There was a report from one of the law firms this week on the number of properties in the UK vulnerable and liable for insurance claims if we have the same pattern of weather that we've had over the last few years, and if that continues. I think you now see liability for damage becoming the frontier of the debate. There's a law firm, probably I didn't see on the list if there's anyone from them, called Client Earth, which is a very effective, very professional law firm, which specializes in challenges around the climate issue. And they have just opened yet another major case against Shell, saying that some developments they're doing contradict the agreements in Paris. And again, there are strong shadows of the tobacco industry over this. And I quote just one example, and you may be familiar with this. This is Mr. Saul Luciano Latia. He is a Peruvian mountain farmer. And with a little help from Greenpeace, he is taking a case through numerous courts. He hasn't yet succeeded in getting a judgment in his favor, blaming RWE, the German energy company, for the damage done to his local environment. He's very persistent and he has great legal support. And I can just envisage the day when one of those cases, and there are plenty in the US, some here, some in the Netherlands, when one of those cases comes to a judgment that imposes liability on the international energy companies who have continued to produce, even when they're saying that climate change is real and caused by carbon emissions. And that is another cloud overhanging valuations. I think the energy industry believes that it's at least 20% undervalued. The other issue, which I haven't got time to go into, is China. China is a big market, but there are huge questions and now great hostility from the US Congress, both sides of the US Congress. And the question is whether energy companies can work in China or not. Can they be partners? And should Chinese companies be allowed to invest here in the North Sea, as they are doing, and in power supply, and as they wish to with nuclear? So my conclusion is that the legal issues, as you see them from corporate boardroom, is not just a matter of obeying the law. They are now part of investment decisions. What is the legal context in which we're doing this? They're part of calculations on what to invest in. Can Equinor invest in a new field in the UK? And where they should do it? Do they have to go to jurisdictions where the rules are different? And a risk factor, because none of this is fixed. I think there is a corporate realization that the legal framework is there, but it's not set, and it could be very different. If the Chinese attack Taiwan, if there's a decision in The Hague on liability, that could lead to a collapse in value across the whole sector. If the interpretations of national net zero policies by the governments change, that could rule out a lot of the developments that are being planned. Those are political decisions, but they'll be expressed through the law. And all that means that company boards have to be acutely aware of the legal environment they're working in now and could be working in the future. So for them, the law is as important as geology. Probably more important because you know what the geology is, you don't know what the law is going to be. So I think you all have a great future and a job for life. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Butler, for your stimulating lecture. And for law firms, it appears to me there are several takeaways. I'll have a question at the end, and I welcome also others to ask their questions. We'll have just one round of questions. So one takeaway is, given the growth of population in Asia, to strengthen their Asian practices, perhaps Asian offices. The other takeaway is to pay more attention to renewables, because that will cause many legal disputes in the future. The third one, again, dealing with Asia, maybe learn Chinese, learn Mandarin, so that you can handle China challenges from China. And cooperation with regulatory lawyers on issues such as sanctions, because now there is more and more public interference, public policy, foreign policy decisions which affect private relations. And one thing which I have not heard much is, what do you think about risks of sort of risk management in the future? So is, for example, BIT, the role of bilateral investment treaties playing a role in strategic decisions, or first you make a decision and then you sort of structure your investment accordingly, or you actually pay attention to let's say, whether a particular jurisdiction is a party to multilateral or bilateral investment treaties to protect investments. So the question is about treaty planning. That's the first question, and we'll have, I hope, a few more questions from the room and also from the online audience. Are there any more questions? Or okay, it's Matthew. The mic will be here.
Fantastic presentation and overview.
Introduce yourself, please.
Oh, Matthew Weiniger. I'm a partner in Linklaters in London. Thank you very much for that fantastic overview and dive into many of the issues. As somebody who's also very involved in watching energy policy around the world, one thing that often strikes me is the level of public debate. I mean, you mentioned that there's going to be controversy about Rosebank, and there's going to be the call to shut it down without really any view taken of what's that oil need that will still be in the UK, what's it going to be replaced with? And, you know, when the UK public debate is mainly gluing yourself to a snooker table or something, does this make you despair at the lack of information in the public domain, or do you think there's a way of improving the standard of the issues being considered?
Thank you, Matthew. Are there any more questions in the room or from the online audience? If not, we will have more questions in during the coffee break.
Yes, one more.
Okay, one more question. Introduce yourself, please.
Yes, Jennifer Yunan. I'm a partner at Sherman Sterling in Paris. Just a quick question. So I understand the key takeaway for lawyers, which seems quite rosy, but what's the key takeaway for energy companies, in particular, given your experience? So what can and should they be doing in the current climate and with all the uncertainty that you've mentioned?
Okay. Shall I try and deal with all those? First, on your point on Asia, at least one of the international majors is currently considering moving their headquarters to an Asian location because that is an area where the growth is. So I find it very interesting. The big companies have all now become very diverse with people from all sorts of different backgrounds and countries. They're not the white British people that they were when I joined. But there is on the top levels, the top 3 levels I looked at of all the major international energy companies, there's not a single Chinese citizen. And that's partly, no disrespect to anybody here, because of distrust. And the feeling that Chinese report back to the Chinese government. Again, going back to when I was in BP, this is a public story. We found that we had a great plans to do more and more in China. It is obviously the market and a lot of opportunities. So we had a team and we recruited local people, and we found that Chinese staff were meeting once a week on a Friday morning at 11 o'clock in a room, and we found this meeting was being chaired by quite a junior person in the office. And said, what's the, and with no non-Chinese citizens there. And we asked, and they said, no, nothing to worry about. So we kept asking, and it turned out this was the party meeting. And he was the party secretary. And he said, there's nothing to worry about. But it was very clear that he reported back to the party on anything that we had planned. So I think there is it's very difficult to penetrate countries like that, and unless they really want it. Treaties, yes, I think you're right. They are now part of the consideration, but I think there is also a wariness that treaties can change, and with a change of government or a change of policy in a particular country. So they would not be relied upon. They are part of the context, but people break treaties. Ask President Putin. The level of public debate, quite right. We're just thinking of a project at King's to find out what people's real level of understanding of the energy issues actually is. Do they know how hydrogen is used? Do they know what percentage of energy supply comes from renewables? Do they know which is the most cost-effective way of reducing emissions? Do they know how much we rely on oil and gas and where we would get it from if we didn't get it from the North Sea? The answer to all those questions is that level of knowledge is very low. And so therefore you have to rely on the level of knowledge of public servants and politicians who are leading the decisions. But of course, they are shaped by public opinion because they have to win elections. So there is I think there is a great need for education of the realities of this and of the speed of change. I mean, how many people here have a heat pump in their house? You're a hero. It was cheap. Well, there's supposed to be a massive program of heat pumps coming in, but no idea. I mean, you're lawyers, you can afford them. Most citizens, it's 10 to 15,000 for a heat pump and to be installed. And there's much talk that they don't really work as efficiently as they're supposed to. I'm sure your deluxe version will, but
part of the debate. I mean, I had one and took a decision to spend a bit more at the beginning to have a new build house.
right. And
Sorry,
of course,
our
most
online audience wants to hear about the heat pump.
I mean, it's part of the debate. It was a new build house which was designed around a heat pump, and being a lawyer, I could afford the upfront capital cost. To the idea that you could do. I mean, I'm from a Hull in Yorkshire, so I'm not used to a string of terraced houses and how that works. The idea you could replicate what I did in new build in a terraced house in Yorkshire, it's impossible.
And so again, unreality policy is very dangerous. Promise that we're going to be net zero by 2030, 2035 in a lot of areas is very ambitious. And the final one, key takeaway for the companies, it is that open globalization is over. You have to be aware of this protectionist context. You can work within that. But also, and I find this is just beginning, is whether the oil and gas side of the industry should go private rather than being public companies. And that has not reached any sort of resolution yet, but they are under real pressure.
Thank you very much, Professor Butler, for your presentation and for answering all these questions. Let's have another round of applause. Thank you. And now, without any break, we're moving to